Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Simpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on simpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hi, adapters. Today our guest is Dr. Aaron Wolf. Aaron is professor of geography in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University and directs the program in water conflict management and transformation. He has spent his career mediating conflicts over water resources both in the U.S. and around the world. Aaron is going to introduce us to how we can transform conflict through emotional and spiritual lenses, in addition to physical and mental lenses. Hey, Aaron, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks, Doug. Good to be here.
All right, so looking forward to this conversation, but I'm checking in with my guests. Where are you at? And you're a professor at Oregon State, but how are you handling COVID-19?
Oh, like anybody else, I'm just hunkered down. Happen to be in Tampa, Florida. I spent a number of months in Budapest, and then caught a flight out, and now basically based here in Tampa till my sabbatical's over in September.
Okay, are you guys already planning for remote learning at Oregon State, or what's the plan?
Well, it looks like we'll do a mix of both. We want to get people back in-house as fast as possible, but safely. So I think we're going to do some kind of a hybrid model through into the fall. But we'll see the students as much as we can.
I'm sure that's a challenge the universities are having, I guess, to decide all over the place how they're going to model it. Here in Arizona, that's going to be a mixture too. So yeah, it's I'm sure frustrating for the students too. All right, so we have you on. We're going to talk about conflict resolution, and there's various ways to talk about this. But with you, let's talk about using faith and local traditions, and these are frameworks. And so could you give us a little bit of background, what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I'll give you some of my background as well. I started off trained as a scientist. I knew that water and politics were connected to each other, and I thought, like a lot of folks, that learning the science was the pathway to help people come together politically, and did that. I worked as a groundwater hydrologist for a number of years, and would come in with the answer to a problem, and in a room full of angry people, and not surprisingly, they continued to be angry, even though I'd figured out the answer. And so that led me to realize that really people were at the heart of fixing almost any problem, no matter how complex. It's often addressed by a small group of people, and I needed training in that. So I went and learned conflict resolution, again, in a kind of Western model. At the time, getting to yes was kind of the touchstone. It's the Harvard School of Conflict Management, and which is awesome. This idea of alternative to a legal structure was a great step forward. But it's all in the head. It's all rational. It's all separating the people from the problem, and inventing options for gain. And so these are things that are great if there's no deep emotion involved. And then I started acting as a facilitator, a mediator, and as most people involved in conflict find out quickly, there's very little rational involved in most conflicts. The mediators say the issue is never the issue. And so I needed to understand more, how do people tap into the discordant energy, or the emotions, or even the spiritual disconnect that people are experiencing, on top of the rational, the mental models that that I'd been exposed to. And that led me to now, I think, an 8 or 9 year quest of understanding from faith traditions, from local traditions, what are their models for understanding discordant energy, conflict, anger? What are the sources, and what are the frameworks that they use to help work through these same types of issues?
Okay, speaking of those frameworks, the framework of having these four lenses, could you walk me through those?
Sure. It's a fairly universal structure, and most faith traditions tap into these kind of four lenses, and psychology students will recognize Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Basically, what we understand is that we look at the world, or can look at the world, through four prisms. One is the physical, the things that we can see, that we can touch, and these also exist in our body. We have physical reactions to conflict. Our pulse goes up, our we tense up, and then there's an emotional response also. So maybe we'll get angry, or we see the world through emotions. And certainly now, in today's world, we see quite a lot of emotion going around, and emotion tends to feed off of itself and off of each other. So there's a lot of anger meeting anger, and often we personally use emotions like anger to push the discomfort, to push the physical discomfort away. So we say anger is a shield protecting vulnerability. Then you'll look at the world through the mental lens, and that's partly intellectual and partly intuition. And so here we're calculating what's efficient, what's maybe we need to learn something about how somebody else thinks, or we can calculate better uses of a resource or something. And then finally, there's the spiritual connection, and the spiritual set of needs that we have. And this is the lens through which we understand that we really are all connected to each other, and really every living thing. And so the idea is to use these four prisms, if you will, both to understand what's happening inside of you during conflict, that you move through those four levels, but you can also use it as a checklist for what groups can need in order to be facilitated through a conflict. So any group has physical needs, emotional needs, mental needs, and spiritual needs. How do you design processes to address all of them?
Okay, so Western approaches, I guess, focus more on the physical and mental lenses. Is that true? And why is that?
Well, I think if we go back to what we call the Enlightenment, and I put quotes around that, this was a really conscious kind of reaction to church politics in Europe. But the idea was that we would take our rational self and separate it from our spiritual self. So these are the physical and mental needs, and we'd separate those from the emotional and spiritual needs. And we just decided that public discourse, that our dialogues, that our conflicts, that anything we talked about in public would need to be rational and measurable. And again, I'm putting rational in quotes. And so we decided that we can measure things like love and attraction and intelligence and all kinds of and conflict. And you can have this other life, this spiritual and emotional life, but it's closed. It's within your family, your Friday, your Saturday, Sunday community, and you don't bring it into public. And so I think in the quote West, we're really good about dealing with physical and physical and mental attributes of a conflict. And oftentimes the roots of the conflict and the exacerbation of the conflict are precisely in the emotional and spiritual realms that we're so bad at talking about.
So you've identified these four lenses, and you can actually develop a checklist as you're dealing with parties when you're, I guess, starting the conflict process. How does that work, though? I mean, you're interacting, and you mentally you have all the structure for it, just to say we're ticking these off. I know we're covering these four lenses. I mean, how does that work?
That sounds like a very rational model for
Okay,
for
it's
this
the
whole
Western
structure.
mindset, right?
No, you're in a sense you're right. Look, conflicts happen. They start intrapersonal. We have our conflicts within us, and so we know that we move through all of this internally. But then, if I'm thinking about a group, for example, example, what are the physical needs of the group? More often than not, the conflicts I'm involved with are the processes are set in some basement with no natural light, with no natural air, and were formally set either in a classroom style or conflictively facing each other with the most conflicted people sitting next to each other. So all just thinking about what are the actual physical needs. Well, you need light, you need air, maybe emotionally, maybe it's better to sit side by side with the person with whom you have a difference than facing each other. And energetically, that tends to work much better. You're taking this energy and turning it into this energy, reminding ourselves that no matter what our traditions, we generally pray side by side, and facing each other is where we conflict. So, thinking through each of these, what are the emotional needs? Most people come into a room, they want to talk, but what they need is to be heard. So, how do you develop a process that allows for people to do both, to get the chance both to speak, but also to listen to each other and really hear deeply what's going on with the others?
Well, I'm sure you must be a history of conflict and then successful conflict resolution. Are you able to sort of like reverse engineer this successful outcome and say they were successful in managing this conflict because of X, Y, and Z when they came together? Do you have that luxury? Have you been able to sort of look at those things like that?
Well, I certainly have my own personal experience of both successes and I don't want to say failures, but much less successful processes that I learned from. But sure, I think so. I think there are examples, particularly in the Middle East, that people have decided historically that if you can only if you can just apply enough force to a problem, the problem will be fixed. And simply not the case. Understanding that people are both a combination, as I say, of justice and mercy, or rationality and spirituality. Maybe a certain amount of force is necessary, but then you also have to figure out a just solution that meets the needs of all the parties.
So you must have enough experiences now too with the four lenses that again, like you're going to another country, each lens might be emphasized differently, right? They might need more, like you mentioned, the Western approaches has this. And is that something that you're thinking about even before you step in that room? It's like we're likely going to have to really focus on the emotional side. Does it get down to that level when you're using those lenses?
Yeah, I think so. The a lot of the kind of Western indigenous traditions talk about the spirit wheel, and they remind us that all four of these need to be in some kind of balance. And so, oftentimes, if I'm working, say, in Southeast Asia, I'm regularly reminded that. We generally don't talk overtly about conflict because people lose face when you do that, and oftentimes the needs of the group are supersede the needs of the individual. And so these are ways of kind of looking not just at the world, but also at processes for dialogue that feel very different than we might experience here in a kind of US corporate setting, where it's really all about the individual and what you can gain rather than balancing the needs of the individual versus the needs of the group.
So you've worked on areas of water conflicts. Could we talk a little bit about that? I mean, is that more in North America and the United States, or is that both international? Like, and maybe there's some examples you want to share.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's some 310 river basins that are shared by two or more countries. And a lot of those are shared by countries that really don't like each other very much. So the Jordan between Israelis and Arabs, or the Indus between Indians and Pakistanis. And this is all over the world, but also certainly within the US. And it's on the arid side in the Western US, of course, farmers and environmentalists and tribes and so on all need to sit around the table to work through their shared water resources. But even in the humid parts of the country, in the Chesapeake or Southeast, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, wherever you have water that crosses any kind of boundary, it's going to bring people together to talk about their shared futures. So this is what brings them in the room. And again, when we're talking about water, there's four kinds of water. So we're used to talking about the physical water and the mental water that we can measure. But again, water emotional water, water representing power or sovereignty or history, and then spiritual water. All of our traditions tap into that, often are at the roots of the conflict, but also are helpful in helping us figure out paths forward to a dialogue around our shared future.
Maybe we could mediate the Tri-State Water War for Georgia and Florida here. I worked in Georgia for a few years, and I was in the thick of that. And then I grew up in Florida, and I was always sympathetic to the Florida position because it was at least more on the environmental side. Need more water for the bays, and then Georgia. It was we want to help develop growth in North Georgia, and it seems so clear, black and white. But I guess it's not. But were you able to follow that at all? Any insights to what's going on there?
Oh, absolutely. I joke that I'd rather work in the Middle East than in the Southeast U.S. because precisely because of that. I worked for 5 years at the University of Alabama, also, and part of it was involved in this group. And I remember somebody explaining the ACT and the ACF to me, and these two rivers that flow through the three states. And I had just made a presentation about the Middle East, and he said, "Man, that sounds a lot like what we have going on down here." And I said, "Well, nobody's shooting at each other." And he said, "Well, not yet."
Well, what was so interesting too about the Georgia situation is that you had North Georgia and the reservoirs for drinking water, but then South Georgia, they had all the farmers and they wanted the water. So they were at odds with their own state on how much water was being allocated, but they didn't want to give it to Florida. So it was a big fat mess down there. I'm sure those things keep you busy.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious when you're going, especially in international conflicts, and I'm not quite sure when I think of, all right, if this whole meeting fails, could it lead to actual like military action versus, all right, and again, back in the United States, if you're in a watershed, well, it's going to lead to legal action. If we can't resolve our differences here, with those kind of stakes, how does that factor into your approach? Do you do the exact same thing? Because it just seems like that would really drive a lot of decision making if like, okay, people are going to go to war if we don't resolve these conflicts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think my experience, honestly, is that in a lot of parts, even of the U.S., water conflicts have really really high stakes. I mean, even an individual farmer is about to lose his livelihood because of either water availability issues or regulations or whatever, that's about as serious as it gets. And certainly our relationships with the tribes have been one about controlling water and using that as a way to control tribal development. And so I think there are really really high stakes here in the U.S. But also my experience is that people almost never fight physically over water at the international scale. Um, we've gone through and looked at events of cooperation versus conflict, and people actually cooperate internationally about 2/3 of the time versus 1/3 being conflictive, and almost all conflict is verbal conflict. Politicians talking about it or journalists writing about it, and there's very very little actual violence across boundaries, specifically around water. And having said that, these processes of actually resolving or managing a dispute take up often a decade to really figure out, to hone in all of the detail to the point where you have an agreement and an organization that's managing the resource across a border. So I'm rarely in a situation where a set of meetings that I'm involved with could result in violence. Stakes are often very very high. Do you build a dam and flood out one subset of the population and cut off fisheries and villages downstream? But rarely is violence on the table. But I think this is true about water universally in the US and around the world, is that it's such a critical resource that it forces people into the room, even people who don't like each other, even people across politics and across borders, and requires them to sit in the room until the issues are hammered out, because there really are no alternatives to access to water.
Well, water management's already hard enough as it is. Have you had a chance to really ponder what climate change might mean? You kind of people move around, they shift. There's all sorts of different pressures on water resources. But if you think about the models around climate change, it's going to keep probably you busy for a long time. Have you had a chance to really kind of think of that through?
Oh, sure. I think we tend to think in terms of changes writ large, and so the migrating population is a major issue. Economic development is a major issue. Population growth is probably the biggest driver driving change in access and demand for water, and climate change affecting especially variability around the margins. And so we're seeing we have an agreement with. US and Mexico that goes back to 1944. And there's been a drought. Oh, we're going on 10 years in that part of the country, and we just can't keep the terms of the agreement. And so we've been constantly modifying and working with our Mexican counterparts to kind of work through how do you deal with this decrease availability and increase in variability. So it's just another thing to think about in terms of all the changes impacting the globe. And one more thing that I think keeps people at the table to talk through the issues.
Just have a couple more questions, but I wanted to give you a chance. You've written a book called The Spirit of Dialogue: Lessons from Faith Traditions and Transforming Conflict. I wonder if you could just give a little bit more background on what the book's about.
Yeah. Well, this one I kind of stepped away from my academic hat and really thought about what I had wished I'd known when I was training in conflict resolution. West setting, what are all the amazing sets of tools and techniques and models that faith traditions and local traditions have used and tapped into over really generations to help. And so, if you look, both the Baha'i and Quakers actually have spiritual practices around group process. So one of the simple things that the Baha'i do is when you come up with an idea in a group, you immediately relinquish ownership of the idea. And this sounds like such a simple thing, but it is actually a spiritual practice, and would that most of our meetings ran that way. People get vested in their own ideas simply because they're their own ideas. But even thinking much more sophisticated, the Buddhists especially have a lot of the mindfulness techniques that most traditions have are so helpful in conflict management, in learning how to listen from the heart, not just from the ears, but really listening to a place to fully understand and empathize and put oneself in the shoes of the other, but also energetically. Is there's a Buddhist practice of being able to actually calm somebody next to you down physically simply by controlling your own breathing, matching their breathing, and then slowing both of them down. So these are the kinds of things I think that there's a host, dozens and dozens of very, very useful tools that I think we can bring into kind of our Western models of conflict management. And so I wrote this book for that. What have I learned in my 8 or 9 year quest, sitting in ashrams or with Buddhist monks or in Vatican City or wherever else? What are the things that I learned that I think would be useful for kind of a Western trained mediator?
And so the book is available now, though, right? You can.
Correct.
All right, we can share a link to that on the post for this episode. Well, I do want to wrap this up, but I guess want to finally just kind of get your thoughts. We would love to continue this conversation around water conflict and conflict resolution. If you had any, other topics that, we'd love to have you back on. I think we're just scratching the surface here, but maybe there's a specific case study that you want to dig into that would, I think, really be interesting for folks. And I mean, I would be very interested. So any thoughts there, maybe moving forward?
Oh, it would be a pleasure, Doug. I think in general, in this whole world of environmental conflict management, that I think we could really think about. Oh, cases like the Jordan River that have literally been transformed, both physically and in terms of more holistic management. Thinking about working between Israelis and Arabs, not just to make sure everybody has drinking water, but also in stream flows. And I know you've had folks from EcoPeace on the series. Amazing work in that part of the world. And I think there are cases. Oh, we can go back to Florida and hang on the Alabama and the Coosa and the Tallapoosa to talk about Georgians and Alabamians and Floridians. Absolutely.
Gotta dust off those old files and catch up on that. Well, Aaron, this has been a pleasure. It's been a real treat to talk to you. I want you to stick around. We're going to just transition into just chatting. It's just a chance to kind of, it's not the official episode, but again, thanks for coming on. This has been a real treat.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Doug.